and Steven Levitsky, who are co-authors of a very highly praised and very interesting book called How Democracies Die, What History Reveals About Our Future. So we feel very fortunate to have Daniel and Steve with us today and look forward to a very, very interesting and insightful discussion. I'm Dr. Richard Downey. I'm the chair of the programs committee for the World Affairs Council of Orange County. And we are delighted to have all of you here with us today. You know, many of our members are, of course, from the local area, but we have also members, or we have viewers from throughout the United States and even as far as Middle East, Europe, and Canada. So wherever you are, we welcome you and are happy to have you with us. We have about a little less than 200 in our audience today. So if you'd like to ask a question, you need to be a participant in this lively discussion today. And you can do that simply by going down to the bottom of your screen and going down to the Q&A button or the chat button and type in your question. And you could do that at any time throughout the session, but the question and answer session will be hosted at the end by our vice chair of the programs committee, Rick Putnam. And we'll have about 15 or 20 minutes to answer questions following the session with Daniel and Steve. We're also really pleased today to have with us as our moderator, Dr. Ann Phillips. Ann is currently senior advisor to the U.S. Institute for Peace in Washington, D.C.'s the Nagorno-Karabakh project. Previously, she was a senior advisor at the USIP on their civil military relations program, where amongst many other things, she hosted workshops for African Union peacekeepers, as well as government advisors, US government advisors who were going to foreign countries. She also worked at USAID, the Agency for International Development. And following that time, she had an assignment that I really envy. She was the director of their program for security, stability, transition, and reconstruction in a place called the George Marshall Center in Garmisch, Germany. And if you haven't been to Garmisch, it's a wonderful town in the Bavarian Alps, very close to Austria and southern Germany. And it's the kind of place where you can practically go skiing at lunchtime. So I'm sure Ann did not do that. I'm sure she was too busy, but I would have. Ann, we are really pleased to have you with us today. Ann has got her PhD from the Georgetown University in International Relations and Comparative Politics. She was also a Fulbright professor at the Friedrich Schiller University in Germany. So we are so pleased to have you with us today. Ann, would you please introduce our guests and start the session? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to join you this afternoon. And thank you, Colonel Downey, for the introduction. I'm delighted to introduce Steve Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, both professors at Harvard and co-authors of How Democracies Die, which is the subject of our discussion this afternoon. Dr. Levitsky is professor of government. His areas of research include political parties, authoritarianism, and democratization with a regional focus on Latin America. Dr. Ziblatt is Eaton professor of the science of government. That's something I'd like to discuss with him, what that means. Anyway, and director of the transformations of democracy at the Wissenschaftszentrum für Sozialforschung in Berlin, which is a well-known social science research institute. His focus and research, his research and writing focus on Europe and the history of democracy. And both have many, too many publications to even list. So just a few, as a former professor, I have to make a few introductory remarks about the topic myself. In recent years, many books and articles have sounded the alarm bells about democratic backsliding, which was unexpected, at least in some circles, and has taken some by surprise. And it wasn't that long ago, but here I'm dating myself, that Sam Huntington's Democracy's Third Wave was being celebrated, which was quickly followed by Frank Fukuyama's The End of History and The Last Man, This was in the early 90s, a time of incredible optimism and a conviction, at least in the US, but in perhaps in many Western countries, that some form of market democracy was the only model remaining that could have global appeal, because nationalism is intrinsically exclusionary. Well, the democratization trend continued, albeit with setbacks, until 2006, according to Freedom House. But since then, Freedom House has tracked 15 years of consecutive decline in global freedom. How Democracies Die makes an important contribution to the discussion of this disturbing trend. I presume most of us consider this a rather disturbing development. And of particular value, in my view, the authors bring their deep expertise on democracy in different regions of the globe to their examination of threats to democracy in the United States. So I have read the book with great pleasure, and there are so many things I would love to talk with you about. So I will restrain myself, and I want to turn first to Professor Levitsky, who has agreed to distill the key points of the book in 5 to 10 minutes, an onerous task to be sure, and then turn to Professor Ziblatt, who will follow with developments in the trends that they identified in the book since the book was written, which I think was 2017. It was published in 2018. So I very much look forward to this. Professor Levitsky.
Thank you, Professor Phillips, and thanks to everyone for the invitation. I'm going to have to talk really fast. And as you say that we're going to focus on the United States case today, but we're happy to talk more broadly about this global trends in the Q&A. So our book, as Anne mentioned, examined the threat primarily facing American democracy after Donald Trump's election in 2016. We argued that the problem wasn't just Trump, but rather the deepening polarization that made Trump possible. And against those who claimed that our Constitution would save us, that the system of checks and balances that contained Nixon would also protect us from Trump, we argued that constitutions by themselves are not enough to protect democracy. Constitutions have to be reinforced by strong democratic norms or unwritten rules. And our book focused primarily on 2 big norms in particular. One is what we call mutual toleration, or accepting the legitimacy of our partisan opponents. That means that no matter how much we may disagree with our rivals, no matter how much we may dislike our rivals, we recognize both publicly and privately that our rivals are loyal citizens who love the country as much as we do, and who have an equal and legitimate right to be out there doing politics, to be criticizing us, to run in elections, and if they win, to govern us. In other words, we do not treat our rivals as enemies or as existential threats. The second norm, a little bit more complicated, is what we call institutional forbearance. Forbearance means refraining from exercising one's legal right. It is an act of deliberate self-restraint and underutilization of power. And we don't often think about forbearance in politics, but it is absolutely vital. We've learned very clearly over the last 4 years in the US, presidents can legally pardon whomever they want, whenever they want. Any president with a majority in Congress can pack the Supreme Court. Presidents can bypass Congress by making policy through executive orders, or as we learned more recently, by declaring a national emergency. For its part, Congress, we know, can legally shut down the government by refusing to fund it. The Senate can prevent the president from filling Supreme Court vacancies, and state legislatures can send their own slates of electors to the Electoral College, contravening the popular vote in their state. In other words, politicians can exploit the very letter of the Constitution, even our Constitution, in ways that totally eviscerate the spirit of the Constitution. Legal scholar Mark Tushnet calls that behavior, using the letter of the law to subvert the spirit of the law, he calls it constitutional hardball. You look at any failing or failed democracy anywhere on earth, and you will find an abundance of exactly this, of constitutional hardball. Hungary, Turkey, Poland, Russia, Venezuela. What prevents a democracy from descending into a destructive spiral of constitutional hardball is this thing we call forbearance. It's a shared commitment among politicians of all parties to institutional restraint, to not using the letter of the law to subvert the spirit. Couple quick examples. Think about presidential term limits in the United States historically. Prior to 1951, as you all know, the Constitution placed no limits on presidential reelection. Our leaders could be president for life, just like Danielle Ortega. But for nearly 150 years, following a precedent set by Washington, no president sought a third term. It was not the Constitution that prevented ambitious presidents like Jefferson, Jackson, and Grant from seeking a third term. It was a norm of forbearance. Or take the filibuster in the Senate. For most of the 20th century, the filibuster was rarely used. There's an average of one filibuster a year, one a year between 1917 and 1960. Senators exercised forbearance. These two norms, mutual toleration and forbearance, serve as what Daniel and I call the soft guardrails of democracy. They are what help prevent normal, healthy political competition from spiraling into the kind of partisan fight to the death that wrecked democracies in Europe in the 20s and 30s and in South America in the 60s and 70s. Now, America's soft guardrails used to be pretty strong. In fact, for most of the 20th century, Democrats and Republicans accepted one another as legitimate rivals and avoided, restrained themselves from destabilizing acts of constitutional hardball. But our book argues, and I think it's become pretty clear now, that those norms have now unraveled. The unraveling began arguably in the 1990s, but it really accelerated, really took form during the Obama presidency, particularly with the rise of the Tea Party. Tea Party Republicans began to treat Obama and the Democrats as the enemy, claiming that they weren't real Americans, that they hated America, that they were trying to destroy our way of life. When we start to treat our partisan rivals as enemies, as an existential threat, we grow tempted to use any means necessary to stop them. That's when politicians turn to constitutional hardball. And that is what happened beginning in particular during the Obama presidency. There were more filibusters during Obama's second term than in all the years between World War I and 1986, Reagan's second term combined. Congress twice shut down the government under Obama, once bringing us to the point of default. And in a move that was without precedent since 1866, the Senate refused to allow President Obama to fill the vacancy created by the death of Justice Antonin Scalia. Now, Trump, of course, took constitutional hardball to a new level, to a point where he tried to legally overturn the results of the 2020 election. But we got to a point after the publication of our book where the president of the United States tried to steal the 2020 election, and the bulk of the Republican Party was on board with that, was okay with that. Now, our book argues that what is driving this process of norm erosion, particularly over the last decade or so, is polarization. Republicans and Democrats have come literally to fear and loathe one another. A recent survey a couple years ago found that 60% of both Democrats and Republicans believe that the other party is a danger to the United States. We have not seen that kind of partisan hatred since Reconstruction. And this is not just traditional liberal conservative polarization. Today's partisan differences run a lot deeper than that. They're about racial and cultural identity. Our partisan identity, party names have not changed very much in the last 50 years, but our partisan identities have changed dramatically over the course of, say, my lifetime. Back in the 1960s, early 1970s, the Republican and Democratic parties stood for different things. They had different platforms, but demographically, socially, culturally, they were pretty similar. Both parties, for one, were overwhelmingly white and Christian, white and Protestant. Three changes have occurred over the last half century. First of all, the civil rights movement led to a massive migration of Southern whites from the Democrats to the Republican Party, while African Americans, in many cases newly enfranchised, became Democrats. Secondly, the United States experienced a massive wave of immigration. Most of those immigrants and their kids ended up in the Democratic Party. And third, since Reagan, evangelical Christians, which used to be evenly distributed between the two parties, flocked to the Republican Party. So today, 50 years later, the Democrats and Republicans represent two very different communities. The Democrats are sort of a weird rainbow coalition of urban educated whites and a range of ethnic minorities, and the Republicans, by contrast, remain overwhelmingly white and Christian. But the thing is, white Christians are not just any group. Not only were they once an overwhelming electoral majority in this country, but not so long ago, my childhood, They occupy the top rung of all of our country's social, economic, political, cultural hierarchy. They filled the presidency, they filled Congress, the Supreme Court, all the governor's mansions. They were the CEOs, they were the TV newscasters, they were the pillars of local communities. Losing a majority, and more importantly, losing one's dominant social status can be a deeply threatening thing. Many Republican voters, not all of them, many Republican voters feel like the country that they grew up in is being taken away from them. And for many, that feels like an existential threat. This is a really important point. I want to close with it, but I think it lies at the very heart of what threatens our democracy today. Democracy requires that parties know how to lose. That means when we lose an election, we accept defeat, we go home, we get drunk, and we get up the next day ready to play again. Not everybody. But for parties to lose graciously, two conditions have to hold. Two conditions must hold. First of all, parties have to believe they have a chance, that they stand a chance of winning again in the future. And second, parties have to believe that losing today will not bring ruinous consequences. When politicians fear that they won't be able to win future elections, or that defeat will bring catastrophe, the stakes rise dramatically. Politicians' time horizons narrow, they throw tomorrow to the wind, and they try to win at any cost today. In other words, desperation leads politicians to play dirty. Think very quickly about Southern Democrats after the Civil War. Reconstruction and the 15th Amendment brought suddenly widespread black enfranchisement. African Americans were a majority or a near majority in most Southern states. So their enfranchisement scared the bejesus out of Southern Democrats and their supporters. Not only did Black suffrage threaten the electoral dominance of the Democratic Party, but it threatened to overturn the entire racial order in the 1870s and 1880s. Facing what they perceived to be an existential threat, the Democrats played dirty. Between 1885 and 1908, all 11 post-Confederate states passed laws that allowed the use of poll taxes, literacy tests, property and residency requirements to effectively eliminate African-American voting rights. Black turnout in the South, as many of you know, fell from 61% in 1880 to 2% in 1912. In other words, unwilling to lose, Democrats stripped the right to vote from nearly half the population, ushering in nearly a century of authoritarian rule in the South. We fear, and here I'm going to pass things to Daniel, that something similar is happening to the Republican Party today. Republicans' future electoral prospects are relatively bleak. They're an overwhelmingly white Christian party, but white Christians are a dramatically declining share of the American electorate. To make matters worse, younger voters are overwhelmingly Democratic. But the problem is not just that Democrats face a potentially bleak, Republicans face potentially bleak electoral future. It's that their base has come to view defeat as catastrophic. Again, many Republican voters fear that they're on the brink of losing not just elections, but losing their country. The very idea of a white Christian America seems to be slipping away. That sense of loss is pushing many rank and file Republicans toward extremism. A poll from earlier this year, sponsored by the American Enterprise Institute, found that 56% of Republicans agree with the statement, and I quote, that the traditional American way of life is disappearing so fast that we may have to use force to save it. 56%. So like the old Southern Democrats, Republicans have begun to play dirty. Let me turn now to Daniel.
Great, thank you, Steve. So I was asked to talk about and to kind of take the baton from Steve and to talk about where we are today and what we've learned since we wrote our book and in the last few years. And so I guess I think I'll begin by just saying there's some good news and some bad news. So I'll first talk about the good news. And that is if you accept the premise that Steve just laid out in the premise of our book, that Donald Trump was a threat to democracy in his use and his willingness to use constitutional hardball. So an analogous figure to Viktor Orban in Hungary, or Erdogan in Turkey, or Chavez in Venezuela. If you accept that premise, then the outcome of the 2020 election, where the opposition party, the small d Democratic Party opposition, could win the presidency, could take control of the Senate and retain control of the House of Representatives. This shows you that one key check in our constitutional system worked, that is elections. Unlike in Hungary, Turkey, of Venezuela, where the opposition has a very, very difficult time of winning, or an impossible, it can't win. Our system, there's still the opportunity for the opposition to win. So that's the good news. The bad news, though, is that this institutional channel didn't work perfectly. And in fact, it almost didn't work. And the events of January 6th, where a group of violent supporters of President Trump assaulted the House of Representatives, culminating a 2-month effort to overturn the election results of the 2020 election, this showed that there was a very near miss. And what this event of January 6th shows us, and to sort of begin with that event, and you think of that, have that event in mind, is what it represents is, in fact, what I think the bad news, which is that there's a very worrying development in American politics, which I think has gotten worse over the last 4 years, which is the extreme radicalization of the American Republican Party. Now, Steve just talked about the virtues of mutual toleration. So when we're talking about one of the two main political parties in our country as radicalizing, as being a threat to democracy, we have to really be self-conscious of this and careful with our terms. And so I want to be very clear here by what I mean by radicalization. First, it's clear that large segments of the Republican Party today appear unwilling to accept the results of free and fair elections, a kind of key hallmark of democracy. Second, large segments of the Republican Party also seem unwilling to unambiguously distance themselves from actors who use violence to try to gain and to hold on to power. So not accepting the results of elections and not willing to disassociate yourself from supporters who use violence. This is very worrying. And I take these as two key indicators of radicalization. Now, the record's pretty clear, I think, on this front, that the Republican Party is no longer a traditional center-right party like Europe's Christian Democratic parties or traditional center-right parties of Europe, the British Tory party, and so on. And in fact, in its best days, in terms of its orientation towards violence, its orientation towards ideology, and so on, it's much more like the fringe radical right parties of Europe. So like France's National Front, Austria's Freedom Party, Germany's Alternative for Germany. And in fact, I think the Trump administration saw these parties as allies within the European Union. So I regard this really, I think we both regard this as an authoritarian turn, which is very dangerous for our democracy. And it's quite surprising for how a democracy is supposed to operate, because in a two-party system like the United States, if you're a political party, you go wildly off course. If you become an extremist, you should be punished at the ballot box. You should lose elections. Democracy is supposed to be self-correcting, like the free market. So if you go off course, you'll lose voters, sort of like a firm that loses customers. What you do is, as Steve said, you maybe you don't go get drunk, but you at least fire the CEO. You hire new middle management. You come up with a new market strategy. You regroup. And indeed, if you ask moderate never-Trumper Republicans today, what will get Republicans back on course, the answer is inevitably devastating electoral losses. Republicans just need to lose badly. Now, I think there's a lot of wisdom in this view. This is how democracy is supposed to work. It's supposed to work as a self-correcting electoral marketplace. Competition in this sense should moderate. But there's really two unrelated developments, I would say, that have collided at our current moment to render this kind of recoil mechanism, this sort of normal self-correcting operation of our electoral marketplace, dysfunctional. So the first is a long-run shift in electoral geography. So in the past, city and countrysides in the United States had a mix of Republican and Democratic voters. But today, the most extreme form in the last 100 years, cities are uniformly Democratic and rural areas are basically uniformly Republican. So this is the first development, this kind of electoral geographic change. The second development, so this factor has crashed into a second development, which is our Constitution, which hasn't changed. Our Constitution has long favored rural areas, as we all know. The Electoral College, where we pick our president, is biased towards sparsely populated areas. So too is the Senate, with 2 representatives, no matter the size of the state. And because the president picks the Supreme Court nominees and the Senate approves them, this also means that the Supreme Court is in this sense tilted in favor of the preferences of rural voters. Now, for the first 200 years of our history, this bias had little partisan effect. So in that sense was not particularly problematic, one could say, because both parties had both urban and rural wings. But today, since rural areas are so thoroughly Republican, this means Republicans have a systematic advantage in the Senate, in the Electoral College, and in the Supreme Court. So our Constitution today systematically favors Republicans. Just to give you some evidence of this, Republicans have won the popular vote for the presidency only one time in 2004 since 1988. One time. And Republicans have only won the popular vote, this means, once in the last 20 years, but have held the presidency 12 of those 20 years. In the Senate, we see a similar story. Democrats in the Senate often win a majority of voters, but Republicans manage to hold on to the Senate. And so today there's a 50-50 split, as we all know, in the US Senate, but those 50 Democratic senators represent 40 million more voters than those 50 Republican senators. And then finally, in terms of the Supreme Court, we've had 3 Supreme Court justices appointed by a president who lost the popular vote, but was also then confirmed by senators who represented less than half the country. Now, I want you to understand that both Steve and I understand the importance of counter-majoritarian institutions. These are critical for the defense of individual liberties, the Bill of Rights, the judiciary, and so on. These are absolutely important. But counter-majoritarian institutions consistently benefiting one party over another is something different entirely. It poses 2 problems from our perspective. And this, I think, has really become vivid over the last 4 years. First, it's leading to a form of minority rule. So Tocqueville famously worried about tyranny of the majority in America. Today, the bigger threat is not tyranny of the majority, but its opposite, minority rule. In order for Democrats to have a lock on the White House, the election blog 538 has estimated that Democrats have to win far more than 50% of the vote. According to their same estimates, Republicans can have a lock on the White House with much less than 50% of the vote. So a political system that regularly allows a minority party to control the most powerful offices in the land without winning a majority is going to have difficulty maintaining legitimacy for a long period of time. Now, again, democracy requires more than majority rule, but without majority rule, you have no democracy. So that's the first effect, this kind of threat of minority rule. But then there's a second effect. It's this system, I would argue, is having a destructive and distorting impact on the Republican Party, to come back to the initial point. So Republicans have become beneficiaries of what we can think of as kind of a form of constitutional protectionism, a set of institutions that really dull the incentive to compete. Because if you can win the most important offices in the land, as Republicans can, without seeking out more diverse voters, why do it? Especially if your base is telling you to radicalize. So if Republicans actually had to win 50% plus of the national popular vote, they would have to seek out more moderate voters and more moderate candidates, but they don't. So in other words, this kind of recoil mechanism, the self-correcting mechanism of our democracy is broken. The electoral marketplace is broken. This is dangerous for American democracy, because what this means is that a party can now radicalize without paying a price, an electoral price. And once a process of radicalization begins, it's very often hard to stop. So given all of this, looking forward, we think the biggest near-term threat are the 2022 and 2024 elections, because Republicans are likely to win control of the House of Representatives in 22. And if they do, if the 2024 election is close, as it likely will be, and if you look at recent Republican efforts to seize control at the level of states, of local election administration, there's a very good chance the presidential election in 2024 will be disputed, throwing the race into the House of Representatives, as happened in 1801 in the United States, 1825, and 1877. But today, unlike those earlier moments in American history, one of America's 2 parties has embraced this form of constitutional hardball or even potentially anti-constitutionalism. So this increasingly Trumpist House leadership, which has become even more Trumpist in the last 5 months, would almost certainly hand the presidency to the Republican candidate, or we have this fear anyway, no matter who actually won the election. And the current Supreme Court is probably unlikely to stop this. So in other words, there's a reasonable chance that the 2020 election that we just got through was just a dress rehearsal for what could come in 2024. So the stakes couldn't be higher. Now, what to do about all of this? So as I said, the stakes, of course, are incredibly high in the 2022 and 2024 elections, but really it's important to think that, each election can't be a national emergency where everything is on the line. So we need to think more long-term. And in our view, I think the only way out is to push for a series of reforms that empower majorities, that allow this electoral marketplace to operate. This would simultaneously democratize our democracy and would provide incentives for Republicans to moderate. So again, we need to kind of repair and mend our democracy's recoil mechanisms. So the kinds of reforms we have in mind are increasingly being talked about by others as well, a series of voting rights reforms to make it easier to vote, automatic voter registration, the elimination of the filibuster in the US Senate, which is an instrument of essentially minority rule, the extension of statehood to Washington, D.C., and even potentially getting rid of the Electoral College. This is a steep hill to climb, but constitutional reforms have passed in the past in America, And these reforms would all make our democracy more democratic. And more than that, they would diminish the distorting impact of what we're calling constitutional protectionism. It's important to remember, this is my final word here, that America is really an outlier. I mean, no country, no democracy has a filibuster like ours. No country has an electoral college like ours. Other democracies eliminated similar pre-democratic institutions over the past 100 years. So I think it's time we do the same. This is important, I think, because, and here I think Steve and I are actually more optimistic perhaps than we sound, majorities of Americans today embrace the core tenets of democracy. Majorities of Americans accept the increasingly diverse multiracial democracy that we're becoming. But we just simply need to reform our institutions so that these majorities can actually govern. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you both very much. And wow, I'm very impressed you could end on a positive note, because the whole litany of things was really very depressing. But you had me there when you had DC voting rights. I live in DC, so yes, but that's a personal political view that yes, we residents of DC, 700,000 of us should have representation. But what you've described, and I agree with almost everything, but it suggests to me that the public commitment to democracy has always been rather tenuous. In other words, you point out very well in your book that for a long time it was based on Jim Crow legislation, on racism, and not to mention actions against Native Americans, the original populations here. So it was always in a way under the umbrella of democracy, but rather exclusionary for the privileged, if you will, masked under these institutions and so on. Would that be fair, or am I being too negative about this? What do you think? Either one.
No, I think it's fair. Now, it's very important to point out that no other society has managed to pull off multiracial democracy either. But I mean, it's certainly true that the norms and that Daniel and I focus on of mutual toleration and forbearance were strong in the United States during a period in which the political community was largely restricted to whites. And it is far from impossible to develop strong democratic norms in the context of a multiracial society. But that's the challenge. That's the challenge we're facing right now. And again, it's worth noting that other societies are, more stable democracies. Most of them in the world are much more homogeneous societies than the United States. And so it's in that sense, the U.S. is really at the frontier in trying to build a multiracial democracy.
I would just add that, I mean, the first part of your question, there have been demagogic figures throughout American history who, we don't have opinion poll data going back to the 19th century, but we actually have opinion poll data going back to the 1930s when the field of opinion polling was invented. And going back to at least the 20s and 30s, there, figures like that we talk about in our book, Henry Ford, Huey Long, Father Coughlin, who was a kind of, right-wing radio personality with millions of followers. These guys all had opinion approval ratings of around 30-35%. So I think it's really not too much to say that, there's always been a segment of American society that has found these sorts of figures appealing. What's different is that, of course, none of these figures ever were president or held, major national office. So in a way, I don't want to blame our voters for our ills, although we're a democracy. And I think from our view, I mean, if you look at opinion poll data today on attitudes toward democracy, although there's decreasing trust and people do point to this, overall majorities are still broadly democratic. And so the problem is in our institutions. It's the rules of the game in a certain way that we've built for ourselves, that we inherited from our Constitution, that are a mismatch with the kind of economic, social developments, cultural developments. And so that's why we need to reform our institutions, because we, essentially we're all Democrats, but we've been constrained. I mean, there's some less democratic than others, but majorities are democratic, but those majorities don't govern because of our rules.
Right. Well, and just a couple of polls that I've read. a 2021 poll, 80% of Republicans do not think Biden was legitimately elected president. And in one a May 17th poll by CBS YouGov, 47% of Republicans thought changing voting rules were much more important than presenting policies and programs that would appeal to more voters. And this is, of course, what we see in 47 of the 50 states where they're changing the rules for participation in voting and so on. So that doesn't sound very, very encouraging, I would say. And back to the last election, one could say that if the trend toward authoritarianism were fully rejected, in other words, there was an overwhelming vote for Joe Biden as really a fairly centrist, moderate Democrat of the old school, making deals across party lines and all of this, that could have been a source of comfort, but it wasn't. It was incredibly close. 70+ million people voted for Donald Trump and thought that would be continuing his type of governance would be the best thing for the country. So that was just a comment. So, but a question for both of you, and you mentioned this in the book, but what role do you think social media is playing in this growing polarization and, as you described so well, really kind of establishment of reinforcing cleavages, as sociologists and anthropologists, sociologists, reinforcing cleavages, where we divided along identity lines, not even on policy issues, which you can negotiate. How much money do you spend on defense? How much do you spend on education? That can be negotiated, but you can't negotiate identity in that sense. So how do you see, or what do you see as the role of social media in contributing to some of the problems we face? Either one of you.
Really quickly, I wouldn't overstate the role of social media. I think there is growing evidence. There's obviously something that's new to all of us. It's new to governments, it's new to politicians, it's new to academics, the impact of social media. And the research that I've seen that's come out in the last 5 or 6 years suggests that it's real, that's exposure to social media does have a lot of the effects that we think it does. It tends to radicalize us. It tends to leave us in these echo chambers in which we cease to get access to alternative views, cease to get access to alternative information, and end up via this interaction with a more radical view than we end with. So it does have this radicalizing tendency. It does tend to reinforce polarization. That said, social media does not create polarization, does not invent it. You don't need social media to polarize a society. The United States fell into civil war in the 1860s without Twitter. Spain fell into civil war in the 1930s without Facebook or YouTube or WhatsApp. The polarization that wrecked democracy in Chile in the 1970s was not in any way linked to Twitter. And so I think although it's very important to think about the impact of social media, and I think it's important to think about ways of regulating social media and learning. I think politicians and citizens have to learn how to live in a world of social media. But it's also important to keep our eye on the ball. That Twitter did not create the polarization that's ripping apart our democracy. The fundamental causes lie elsewhere.
Yeah, I guess I agree with that. And I mean, I think Steve and I both agree that it certainly has exacerbated polarization. I mean, it didn't start it, it exacerbates it. And I would sort of put it, I think one way of thinking about the rise of social media is also the decline of traditional media institutions.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's part of a broader set of changes in all Western societies where you have had the decline of major political parties, you've had the decline of major interest groups in labor, business groups, and you've had the decline of media institutions. You know, in the past, we had 3 television stations, you know, Germany had 2, Britain had 1. And today, politicians don't need media institutions to gain access to voters. and to gain access to power, in effect, right? So in that sense, it's made it, social media institutions have made it easier for demagogues to gain power, and polarization in part flows from that. And so, one way of thinking about these broader changes that have opened the gates in a way is a form of democratization. I mean, the kind of media landscape has in certain ways become more inclusive. But one of the things about becoming more inclusive and opening the door to new forms of organization is that freer markets and more democracy doesn't mean less rules. It may mean more rules. And so actually that's sort of a justification for more regulation of social media.
Mhm.
And instead of having companies regulate information, so letting Facebook's own boards govern what kind of information is out there, I think, in fact, democratically unaccountable corporations, I think there's very much a need for new forms of regulation, just as there were back at the beginning of the 20th century when thinking about the rise of big companies in the beginning part of the 20th century.
Yeah. Well, thank you. So you always have a very nice balanced view of things. Well, yes, it's a problem, but on the other hand, let's not overstate it and so on. I, of course, remember the time when Walter Cronkite was the most trusted man in America, and the references were always about what was said on the CBS Evening News the night before. Everybody had a common reference point, which is not there anymore, and has not only contributed, I mean, profusion of opinions and viewpoints can be very positive, creative, etc. But now we're at a point where we don't agree on facts. And the profusion of information sources, I would say, contributes to everyone having different facts on even very basic things. So that causes a certain amount of heartburn for me, at least, when I think about moving forward and the reforms that you suggest, voting rights reforms, getting rid of the filibuster, et cetera, modifying the system so that majorities actually can win elections, which gerrymandering makes sure in some cases does not happen. And I agree with those things. I mean, that sounds very reasonable because it's just for a fairer political system, which could, in theory, should strengthen the social fabric and our ability to work together. But then I'm, as a practitioner, stuck in how we go from the idea to implementation. How can we move toward these reforms in the current political environment? Suggestions, welcome.
So I think, it's obviously very difficult, and it's utopian, in fact, to like say, okay, yeah, and we see that the trouble with, even trying to get voting rights reform through a democratic majority House and Senate right now. So the idea of rewriting the Constitution and getting, the constitutional required majorities in the House, the Senate, as well as all of, the state legislatures is a major hill to climb. So that's all the bad news. I think the good news, though, is that there is a history in the United States of constitutional reform. And in fact, I think there's, three big periods of constitutional reform just in the 20th century alone. One of institutional change as well as constitutional reform. One, Woodrow Wilson, the progressive era in Woodrow Wilson, where you had the introduction of the direct election of the U.S. Senate, women's enfranchisement, the introduction of income tax. I mean, these were things that were radical at the time, but now in retrospect look very commonsensical. Major reforms, of course, under Roosevelt, not constitutional reforms as much as granting labor major rights. And then under Lyndon Johnson, a major set of voting rights and civil rights reforms and immigration reform in the mid-60s. And what's interesting about those three presidents that I've just mentioned is that all three of them were kind of like Biden in that they were creatures of the old regime from which they had come. So Wilson, was a Southerner. Johnson was a Southerner, very much opposed to the old, to these, coming from a societal context that had opposed the reforms that he then became the advocate of. Similarly, Roosevelt was an aristocrat. He became an advocate of labor. And so the question, and so I think similarly, Biden is in many ways a creature of the old regime that we're now advocating needs to change. And so how is it that these unlikely reformers became reformers? And I think somebody in the chat asked the question, how do you get politicians who benefit from the current setup to reform the current setup? And that's the heart of the dilemma. And I think the way you get there is through massive social pressure and where there's and so social movements in all three of these instances change the political calculus of each of these politicians. These politicians carried out these reforms partly because they wanted to, but also because they thought it was electorally beneficial for them to. And so, when the Senate was reformed, and this may seem like an obscure example, but when you had the direct election of the US Senate, you essentially had, and it was a constitutional reform. So this means you had, super majorities of US senators voting to disband the mechanism through which they had gotten into their own seats. I mean, instead of being appointed by the states, they were now going to have to run and be directly elected. They voted to essentially self-abdicate. And the reason they did this, if you kind of go back and look at the history of this, is that there was such social pressure. It was commonsensical that they had to do this reform. So I think that, the strategy has to be not just a strategy of politicians, but a kind of bottom-up strategy that makes reform seem not only desirable, but absolutely necessary and inevitable. But that's a long-term agenda, I understand. That's not going to happen in the next 2 years.
No, well, but one of the, at least my impression, having lived overseas for many years, is that we in the US tend to be fairly short-term in our time horizons. And that's reflected in a whole host of things, of rules and regulations that for economic performance, for political performance, and so on and so forth. But I give credit, if I'm looking very objectively, I say I give a lot of credit to the Republican Party for being very strategic and thinking long-term in their objective. I don't support the objective of minority rule, but think back to Karl Rove. He made it very public. His goal was a permanent Republican majority. The Democrats could certainly still exist, but they would never have any power or influence. And that was the objective. He was very public about it. Others have said
I would say there's a big difference though, Anne. Karl Rove was talking about building an electoral majority. He was talking about winning elections. That's not what the Republican Party is doing now. The Republican Party strategy is to stay in power despite losing elections. Karl Rove wanted to build majorities. I think it's a fundamental difference.
Permanent majority, from his point of view, the idea.
Well, I think that's mostly rhetoric.
Well, maybe, but I think sometimes, I don't think the Democratic Party thinks long-term.
And your point was that they were thinking long-term, at least, not just about the next election.
Very strategic, and they started very intentionally with the governments in the states, establishing Republican majorities, gerrymandering districts, and so on. So it was a very consequential strategy to achieve an electoral majority, if not a majority of the population. So I think they were very clear about that. And you pointed out in your book how Newt Gingrich looked at politics as war and not as so on. So it began quite a long time ago. And I think it's time, I could continue discussing with you. I wanted to ask you a very provocative question. So do you think, but from what you've said so far, I think you would dispense with this immediately, that the United States should break up into different countries. Sociologists have mapped different cultural maps, at least 5 in the US, and we have a lot of things that are in our cultures, in our expectations of government are very, very different. You may remember after President George W. Bush was reelected, there were maps put up where the East Coast and the West Coast joined Canada. And so this has been played around with, but it's kind of interesting to think about that.
I would say, so beyond the obvious logistical and social and cultural and economic consequences of doing that, I think it's misleading to think of us in terms of I'm not ripping off Obama here, thinking of in terms of red states and blue states, because within every red state,
you are ripping off Obama, but that's okay though.
It's a different argument though. I live in deep blue Boston. I don't have to drive very far into the countryside of Massachusetts,
right,
to enter Trump territory.
Yeah.
And in every red state, whether it's Oklahoma or Utah or South Dakota or Alabama, you can find mostly urban areas that are blue. And so there are red-blue divides, deep, profound red-blue divides within every state. And so breaking us up ain't gonna solve the problem.
Okay, well, with that, thank you both very much. And I want to turn the mic over to Rick Putnam, who is going to present questions from the listeners and the people who have been actively paying attention. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Anne. And clearly the amount of questions reflect a lot of passion and interest in your discussion here. So the first couple relate to just the January 6th events themselves, and both of which ask, as you know, is that a warning to the fragility of democracy and danger of dying? I assume your answer there would be yes. That event sort of was symptomatic of that potential. So let me move on to
I would just say though, if I could, just one quick thing to that, which is that, you know, I think instead of thinking about January 6th alone, I think it's important to think about the 24-hour window of January 5th and January 6th, because in January 5th, if you remember the evening of January 5th, you had an African-American and a young Jewish American senator elected to the Senate in Georgia, in you know, the state of, in the past of Jim Crow and segregation. And so this was a very hopeful sign for American democracy. And then within 24 hours to have this attack on the Capitol take place, in some ways, you know, I think both the fact that these happen, it's a kind of microcosm of American society at the moment, where there are these two tendencies, and the forces that propelled the first event in many ways are prompting the reaction that came in the second event. And so I think these two tendencies are both present in American society at the moment. And that's what we're sort of suffering in, the peril and promise of American democracy simultaneously.
Thank you. The third question is interesting because it comes back to sort of I guess the existentialism of government itself. I mean, do the majority of people care what form of government they're under as long as government delivers for them? And if whether or not you agree that government is delivering today, perhaps if it's not delivering, that's the source of tension and issue here between the parties and red and blue.
So it's a really important question. And I want to answer quickly in two parts. One is our system as designed is actually unfortunately not delivering for Americans anymore. And the public polling over Americans' satisfaction with democracy has plummeted over the last 20 years. Go back to, I'm not going to get the numbers exactly right. I think well over 3/4 of Americans in the year 2000 said they were satisfied with American democracy. Today, that number is 50%. Half of Americans are dissatisfied with democracy for good reason. It's our system of divided government only works in a context of relatively depolarized, internally heterogeneous, not very disciplined parties that can work across the aisle. The Constitution was designed with no parties in mind. The founders were very farsighted. They did not think seriously about political parties. They missed that one entirely. And then for most of our history, US parties were internally divided. They were as internally heterogeneous as they were different between themselves. And they were able, for better and worse, to negotiate across the aisle, to build coalitions. And that way, a system of divided government can work and did work. But in a context of intensely polarized, highly disciplined parties, the system cannot work. Divided government becomes dysfunctional almost immediately. And for the last decade, 15 years, we've been unable as a society to confront basic problems facing us, whether it's immigration, climate change, jobs, public health, et cetera. So so democracy is dangerously starting not to work with you. I think people do care about democracy, but everybody in this country grew up under, well, everybody who was born in this country grew up under democracy. We all take it for granted, with the exception of aging activists from the civil rights movement. We all take US democracy for granted. What, in my experience in Latin America, where nobody can take democracy for granted, people learn to appreciate democracy very quickly when they lose it. And I think, and I'm quite sure that would happen here too. The trick is figuring out how to sort of kick it into gear and be vigilant and defend democracy before you lose.
Thank you. Another very interesting question. And I'll interpret it slightly, but was the changing of election rules in the 2020 election, perhaps or perhaps not, in violation of Constitution by judges, attorneys general, and governors in several states, but in the name of accommodating the COVID-19 pandemic? Were those changes a threat to democracy, or what's your interpretation there?
So my sense is that these reforms were intended to expand, to make sure that people could vote, to increase voter turnout. And I think anything that increases voter turnout essentially is pro-democratic. I mean, so anything that makes it easier to vote is pro-democratic. And in fact, having not done anything, I mean, having not allowed for mail-in voting or made it easier for mail-in voting, I mean, it's a little bit counterintuitive, but sort of inaction can be a form of restriction. So sort of standing still when the world has changed around you is a form of restriction. And so I think had these secretaries of state and so on not done this, that would have been a bigger threat to democracy than having made it easier to vote. I mean, clearly this has become a highly partisan issue because Republicans thought that they were hurt by allowing more people to vote. But I would sort of suggest that if you think that you are hurt because more people it's easier to vote, then it's time for some self-reflection. Because essentially, at the end of the day, anything that helps people vote, that's what democracy is about.
Very quickly, I think to me, I'm convinced that the actions taken to facilitate voting in the pandemic were absolutely within the spirit of the law, and the entire federal judiciary was in agreement with that. The vast bulk of the judiciary was in agreement with that, which is why none of these actions were deemed unconstitutional. They were all deemed legal.
Was there any evidence or any papers that indicated that perhaps it enlarged, fraudulent voting or dead people voting, or?
There is no evidence of that.
Would another Donald Trump presidency destroy democracy or a similar, semi-autocratic type president?
U.S. democracy is hard to kill. We have very strong democratic institutions. We have as we saw during the Trump presidency, there was pushback to borrow from George Bush now, 1,000 points of light within the federal government, whether it was courts, whether it's bureaucracies across the country. There are thousands and thousands of dedicated professionals committed to defending the rule of law, working within the government, working in the legal profession, et cetera. So it's not easy to break U.S. democracy. Well, what it will do is gradually weaken and slowly backslide and corrode. And I think had Trump been reelected, 8 years of appointments, 8 years of purging and packing government institutions, beginning with, but certainly not ending with, the Justice Department, would have done great damage. I am very fearful for what would have happened after 8 years of Trump. If he's reelected in 2024, after 4 years of Biden, the turnover of the two parties would be healthy. And I think it's not as if Trump would be able to pick off exactly where he left off. So it's less clear what would happen.
Does the current administration have any room to raise public awareness of the fragility and threats to democracy, and perhaps implement some steps to impede those not interested in democratic rule?
I think they're very conscious of this. I think in one way in particular is that, going back to one of your first questions, which is to try to make government work well for people. I mean, I think this is one of, by having an effective COVID response and having this kind of aggressive, policy of infrastructure development and so on, to make government work for people, I think increases people's faith in democracy. That's one point. A second point is, I think, just in his foreign policy statements or in his justifications for a lot of his policies, President Biden in particular, talks about the competition between democracies and authoritarian systems. And this is part of his kind of way of thinking about the world, it seems. And I think that's, I think that's actually quite useful. I mean, it's a sort of positive form of patriotism in a way, to build up the kind of sense that democracy is something that can do a good job and it's worth defending. I think the final part of this, ultimately would have to be kind of elements of democratic reform, but we've talked about that already.
How about one more before we have to probably end the session, and that would be what about the role of cable news? I know we talked about social media, but what about the role of cable news having played a role in the subversion of American democracy? And I guess I'd throw in the talk show radio as well. But any comments on those channels?
Yeah, one thing I would say is I was recently on a panel with a bunch of data scientists and people who track this. And one of the things they say is that if you track like people retweeting things as a way of building up seeing what the kind of a map of what the various social networks are in the United States, what one sees is that center left and moderate Twitter users talk about lots of different things at the same time. The kind of right end of the spectrum is quite hierarchical and there's a lot of consensus. So in other words, people are all talking about the same thing and retweeting the same thing. And when they've tried to reconstruct where does this begin, they find that a lot of it begins with Fox News. And so in other words, these social networks are quite hierarchical with Fox News at the center of it. So that suggests, at least in the way people are talking about things, cable news, Fox News in particular, is absolutely central. I think the broader media landscape has become more polarized, which is not healthy, because anytime when the media is perceived as part of the opposition, then that's certainly very dangerous for press freedom, actually.
So if I could just say a couple of things. Daniel and I always say that if we ever have to write a book about the breakdown of American democracy, Fox News will probably get a chapter. There's no question that it's played a role. But I would say a couple of things. I mean, we've had partisan media before. Daniel mentioned Father Coughlin. That was a long time ago. He had a lot of followers. There is a role to be played, a critical role to be played by political leaders. And very early, Ann mentioned that 70 or 80% of Republicans believe the election was stolen. One reason that is the case is Republican leaders have crawled under the table rather than speaking out and saying, no, the election was not stolen. The Republican leaders have a responsibility to tell their followers the truth. And if our elite were to converge around some basic things like democracy is a good thing, like the vote was fair, Joe Biden is president, we would be in a somewhat better place. And so it's partly a failure of leadership on the part of mostly Republicans. I would also circle back to my point about social media, which is that, yes, the supply of fake news, for lack of a better term, coming from Fox News and from other cable stations is a problem, but there's also a demand side. Fox News is selling. Fox News is doing what it does because it sells. And remember, this was a really striking that when Fox News began to tell the truth in the aftermath of the election, scores of its viewers fled Fox News for a cable station that would tell them that the election was being stolen. So there is a demand problem, and so fundamentally, ultimately, rather than thinking about what to do with Fox News, we've got to get at the underlying problem of what is making Tucker Carlson so popular.
Stephen and Daniel, thank you so much. And I'm really sorry that we'll have to cut things short here. We're just after 2, and we could probably go on for another 20 minutes. But Anne as well, thank you. Stephen, Daniel, thank you. I want to turn it over to our chair, Nora Valenzuela, for close. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rick, and thank you to our distinguished guests. From the number of questions that you see on site, obviously the conversation was very stimulating and engaging, and we really appreciate that. On behalf of the Board of Trustees and Executive Board, I wish to thank you and welcome you back in the future to our in-person events, because this conversation certainly is not finished in 1 hour. I think we're just beginning. But I must say, as someone who was not born in US and moved to US when I was a young girl, I learned about the process of democracy. And my teacher at school, I think I've mentioned that in previous meetings, I asked my government teacher at school, I was a young girl, about 14 years old, said, what is the difference between Republican and Democrats? Because we were learning that. And my government teacher said nothing. I said, then why do we have two political parties? He said, so we would not have a military coup, and we would have a self-correcting system every 4 to 8 years. And just by listening to you today, it totally validates what he taught me well, if I tell you how many years ago, then you can add up and figure out by age, but over 40 years ago. So I am very pleased to say that as a nonpartisan organization, we welcome differences of opinions and ideas. Our focus is on education and presenting facts to our audience. But thank you so much. I just bought your book just right before the program. I'm really looking forward to reading it and